This video is how to use the figure 8 stitch as part of a brim on a hat. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using this green Nifty Knitter loom. This is one that came in with the blue, the red, the green, and the yellow, where the biggest one had like 41 pegs. This is the next size down. This is what I typically use for a hat for myself, because the yellow one's a little too big sometimes, depending on what I do. But I'm going to show you how to do this idea of a figure 8 as a brim. And I worked up a sample using the blue Nifty Knitter. And it is a little hard to see because I'm going to show you some techniques that we're going to do to make this look different when we do it this time. As you can see, it kind of makes a cool effect of where you can see, my yellow through, because I used the black, and it creates these little openings. Let me bring it a little closer for you. It creates these little openings that are a really cool effect. And what I learned about the sample is what I'm going to show you on here of some things to tweak. Now the one thing to keep in mind is when we're working this brim, it's actually working on the inside of our loom, which means this was on the inside of the loom, which also means you can turn it around, and this is what would be showing on their outside. When this is going down the loom, this is what you see, but what you're making is what's on the inside. So keep that in mind with what stitches you use. This was a tight stitch here, but again, this was the part I cared about, and you can reverse it pretty well. I also think this could be a great idea as like a cuff on a fingerless glove, because the way we're going to do it for a hat, you can easily manipulate it to do part of a fingerless glove if you start with the bottom. So what you're going to want is two different color yarns. They can be subtle or they can be drastically different, like the black and the yellow, and we're going to show you how to do it. Now because the gauge on the Nifty Knitters is a little bigger, typically we have to use 2 strands, but to do the figure 8 stitch, which we're doing first, we can get away with 1 strand of yarn. And what I'm going to be using for this project is these 2 colors. Let me get them over here. The base of my hat is going to end up being in this homespun yarn. It's a bulky weight of 5, and this is actually going to be my hat, sorry. But what I'm going to do for the figure 8 brim is I'm actually going to use, I just got to find the end of it here. I'm actually going to use this blue comfort yarn because I didn't want the dramatic change to be too dramatic. I wanted the colors to kind of go together. So I'm going to do the figure 8 stitch in the top one, and then we're going to use the bottom, and then we're going to end up using both of these at once. So the first thing we need is our blue to be our figure 8 stitch. Find your starting point. What I like with the Nifty Knitters is you got a starting peg right here. And you're going to kind of work this almost like you would do a normal brim. And really, depending on how many rows you go down, will determine how much of the gaps show. And that's what I learned from the sample onto doing a new project. I learned in the sample that I may not want to do as many rows of the figure 8 stitch because I want to stretch it up more to make what you see in between here wider. So what I'm going to do now is we do our cast on row. So I'm going to go ahead and do the cast on row. I just normally do the E-wrap cast on row, and I'll meet you back here to do the next step. So I've done the cast on row. Now we're going to push this down so we can start our figure 8 stitch process. Now again, it's going to depend on how wide you want your brim. And again, if we look at the sample, depending on how wide you want, this is obviously wider than I would normally do a brim. So you may want to only have it to here, you may want it to there, you may want it just really skinny. So that's something that you'll have to kind of play around with and do different swatches to see what width you actually want the figure 8 stitch to be. But what I'm going to do, I think, for this one is kind of play it by ear, which is what I usually do when I do projects. But if you remember the figure 8 stitch, if I hold it this way you can see, we skip a peg and then we wrap. Because my starting yarn is here, behind there, so we're skipping a peg, going to the next, and then coming back. And that's all the figure 8 stitches. But what it's going to do is create a nice open weave. So again, you look at where your starting yarn is, come over by skipping, and go around. And I do have a video just specific to the figure 8 stitch, so go ahead and look at that if you need to reference something. But this is just to show you how to use it in a different way. So again, we're skipping a peg, and we're just working our way around. And that's all this brim requires, is just to do that stitch. Like I said, skipping the peg. Okay. And then knitting over. And this works up pretty fast, and it's a really cool design. I want to give a shout out to Bonnie because she's actually the one that gave me this idea, and I know I forgot to mention that in the beginning. So Bonnie, if you're watching, I didn't forget. So that's all you're going to do. You're going to work your way around doing the figure 8 stitch until you get back to your starting point. So go ahead and do, probably I would say about 3 rows of the figure 8 stitch, and then join me back here. As you can see, I've done 3 rows of the figure 8 stitch, and what we have on the inside is this nice lacy type opening that we're going to use for our brim. But what we need to do now, like I've decided 3 inches, but you can decide to do, or excuse me, 3 rows. Here's a little idea. Oops, let me turn this around so it's the right way. An idea of roughly how wide I did it. It really depends on, like, again, how wide you want that brim. I didn't want it to be too wide, and what we're going to end up doing is stretching this up. So this is going to be about as wide as my brim. And this all laciness will allow the other color to show through behind it, as you can see with my hand. So I'm going to go ahead and now we're going to switch off to the other color. This is your alternate color. Now keep in mind too, excuse me, as I said, that we're working the hat differently. This is the side we're going to see. So any stitches you do, and again, let me show you one here. This originally was on the loom, excuse me, like this. So we were working the inside, but that's what we want on the outside. So we're going to switch over to the other color, and we're going to do a tight stitch like we did on this, like I did on this sample. But again, when we take the loom off, it's whatever stitches are inside. Again, wherever I might have knitted, it looks purled. That's what's going to show up because this is the outside of the hat. It's a little different than normal. Normally when you do the stitches, what you see coming down here would be what's the outside of the hat. But this time, whatever's on the inside is what the outside of the hat's going to look like. A little confusing, but I'm hoping you understand my thought process. So what we're going to do is I'm going to switch. Now I didn't, like I said, this hat is for me. I didn't want to have it be such a dramatic. I want it to be kind of subtle this winter. So I'm using just a homespun yarn. This is super soft. It's a weight of 5. And it's almost as thick as what I had on there. I believe this was probably a 4 and this was a 5. Or they're both 5s. I can't remember exactly. But what I wanted to do now is I'm going to switch over to this color. So what's going to end up happening is we're going to have this nice black, if you look, is going to be behind it. So it's going to be a little subtle change to it. If I wanted to, I could do a really bright color and have that be underneath it and show that. You can even decide to do one color in the figure 8, one color as your background, and then switch to another to do the rest of the hat. I'm keeping it simple and just I wanted to do like a two dark tones together. But again, it's up to you. Now, as I said, we're going to switch the colors, which means I have to find a pair of scissors. Okay. Get my handy dandy little scissors out here. And I'm actually going to cut this off and tie the new color to it. It's just what I like to do. I mean, everyone's different how they like to do stuff, so we're going to find where this is, which is right over here. I'm going to snip it. And lay this aside for later. Now if you notice, this one kind of does fray a little bit. I'm going to give it a little snip before I tie it, just to get rid of the part that was fraying a lot. And now we're going to tie it as tight as we can. So that's close to that peg as we can. If you want, you can double tie it like I do sometimes. Once you get it double tied, then you can turn around and kind of cut off your excess a little bit so it's not as noticeable. And if you just give a little tug, you'll see that it is secure enough that it's not going to come apart. Now what I'm going to do, again, this is going to be the color behind my brim. I'm going to do, a tight stitch with this because I want to be able to not see, I only want to see the holes here. I don't want to see another dimension of holes through the yarn that. So we're going to do the tight, what I call the tight stitch, which is the 1/2 stitch, which gives us a nice, which is what this stitch is on the outside. It gives us that nice stitch that makes it harder to see. You can't necessarily see through the whole project. Oh, I can just talk today, right? So you're just going to wrap, and we've already got, actually I forgot, what I do usually is I'm going to do 1 row of just regular E-wrap, just to kind of move this color over. You can do pearl or whatever, and we might end up with a line, you know, like it did here, which is fine. I like that little detail. So we're going to go ahead Okay. I mean, sometimes I hold it this way, and I'm just going to wrap it. I mean, you can decide to go right into the tight stitch, which I think I might actually do, just to see how that looks. Again, whatever you want to do. We're trying to keep it kind of simple. This isn't supposed to be complicated, so we'll actually just go right into the tight stitch. But you could decide to do an E-wrap right then if you wanted. Now if you remember with the tight stitch, we wrap it 3 times. So there's 3 loops. So we've got 2 here. Now we're going to work it 1 peg at a time because this is bulkier yarn. I want to give us a chance to not make sure it doesn't act up. So I'm going to wrap it. You're going to come down here and get your bottom loop and go over the top 2. You can kind of push the other ones down so that you're ready for when you get to them. Grab your yarn, wrap the next, get the bottom loop. Be careful of not mixing in with your other stitch over the top. Okay. And that's all you're going to do is go around and do the tight stitch. And that's all we're going to keep doing, is you're going to make sure there's 3 loops on a peg, and then take the bottom over the bottom loop over the top 2. And you're going to do this until the width of this new color is probably almost the same as the brim that you have here, because this is going to be folded up onto the black color. So we're going to want to go until it looks about like it's going to be able to fold up okay. So I'm going to go off camera and I'm going to keep working the tight stitch until I get down to that part where I feel it's going to mimic again the width of the brim in there. Like I said, this is about 1.5 inches, but again we're going to stretch it like that. So we're going to want the brim to be a little bigger than that spot there, and I can't necessarily stretch this out and hold the tape thingy. So right now it's about 2 inches, so we may work it our brim about 3 inches. You're going to work it a little bigger, wider than this, hopefully, so we can give it a little more stretch. So I'm going to go ahead and go off camera for a little bit, working the tight stitch, and I'll show you the next step after that. I've worked the tight stitch down a little ways, as you can see, and here's our ruler just to give you an idea. This is in inches. But what we're going to do now, it's really up to you. You could keep going, but when I flip this up, because you can practice flipping it up as you go around to see if it's going to do what you want for your brim. And again, it's really cool when you use 2 contrasting colors like in the sample I showed at the beginning. The first thing you want to do is make sure your working yarn is on the outside of the loom before you start bringing the brim up, just so you don't accidentally get it in there. Believe me, I've done that before. So then all you're going to do is you're going to look back to your first row, and you're going to find a loop on there, and you're just going to place it right back on the starting peg. And you're just going to work your way around, finding the loops from the first peg or the first row and placing them back on the loom. Very gently, you don't need to rush it. It's just finding the first loops and just putting them on. Similar to how you do a normal brim, so there's nothing too different from how you do a brim. It's just we're getting a cooler effect, if you see, by having more of an open weave. And you could probably do this with just doing a knit stitch or a purl stitch in the beginning, because with the nifty knit, if you just use one strand, you're going to have that openness anyway, because you then can bulk up your yarn after you're done doing your cool thing to go around first. So I'm just going to keep working around, and keep in mind again that this is the outside of our hat, even though it's on the wrong side here. We're just working around, finding my first loops as best I can. Almost back to the beginning. Usually you'll get a rhythm going, so you'll be able to find them pretty easy. Now I always want to go around first and make sure I can get the first row all back on before I knit over, because some people may knit as they go, but I want to make sure that it's going to look okay, so I want to make sure all the loops are on before I knit them over. As you can tell, we're getting back to the beginning. And we need one last loop down here, I believe. Sometimes loops want to fall off, but I know there's one more. that I can use here. Okay. So now you're going to kind of push them down a little bit, and as you can see, this is what's going to be our brim. Now, even though I've used two different colors that were kind of dark, if I hold this up closer, you can still see my black behind my blue. And it's going to be pretty cool once it's in more natural light. If I push that through once on my head, it'll look kind of cool. And again, use different alternating colors like I did in the sample, and you'll really be able to see them shine through. It's pretty much the same idea of our peekaboo brim I did, but again, this is using the figure 8 stitch, which gives it a little more of a decorative edge in that. And now what you can just do is go ahead, oops, get you out of the way, and just knit the bottom over the top, and then continue on your hat like you normally would. I'm going to actually be adding in the blue again, excuse me, to bulk up my yarn, because this is more or less for me for the winter. So I'm going to bulk up my yarn so that it's more thick, and I'm going to keep going just like I normally would on a hat. Now keep in mind, whatever stitches you do, you got to look on the inside and see how they're looking, because this is the outside of the hat where the brim is. This is the inside of the hat. But what also is cool is if you get tired of wearing it like that, you can simply turn it inside out and just do this if you want. There's no big deal. So it's almost like a 2 hats in 1 type of deal. But just go ahead, knit over the bottom, over the top. You know, I still got 3 loops on here. If I hold this up, you can see I still got 3 loops. So I'm going to go ahead and knit. Oh, that one missed a loop here. I didn't get a loop on there. There we go. Get over there. Got a little bit of a fuzz from the other that I can trim. But just take out the bottom over the top. I'm still doing the tight stitch, and now I'm just going to work until I get the hat the way I want, cast it off, and I'll be good to go.